Sometimes the greatest treasures in life come in the most unexpected packages. We often look right past what we need most, chasing after what we think we want instead. Marcus Caldwell spent 30 years building the finest ranch in Colorado Territory. His prize horses made him wealthy, but he still needed one thing: the perfect stallion to complete his breeding line. When he heard about a legendary horse trader in the wilderness, Marcus rode out expecting to find his dream horse. Instead, he got Rosie, an old donkey, and her sick foal named Patches. He almost walked away in disgust. But when a mountain storm trapped them together on the dangerous trail home, Marcus learned these simple animals had something his fancy horses never could offer. What could a stubborn old donkey teach a man who thought he had everything figured out? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Caldwell pulled the silver pocket watch from his vest and checked the time with the same precision that had governed his life for 30 years. 6 in the morning, just as every day began at Caldwell Ranch. The watch had belonged to his grandfather, then his father, and now to him 3 generations of men who understood that time was money, and money was the measure of a man's worth. Standing on the wraparound porch of his grand ranch house, Marcus surveyed his empire with the satisfaction of a man who had built something lasting. The morning mist hung over rolling pastures where his prize horses grazed, their coats gleaming like polished copper in the early Colorado sunlight. 30,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, purchased acre by acre, dollar by hard-earned dollar. The barn complex stretched before him like a small town, built with imported timber and fitted with brass hardware that caught the light. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," called Tom Rodriguez, his head foreman, approaching with the day's reports. Tom had worked the ranch for 15 years. A steady man with weather-beaten hands and eyes that missed nothing. Behind him walked 3 other ranch hands, their boots clicking on the wooden walkway Marcus had installed to keep the mud off their feet and the efficiency high. "Morning, Tom." Marcus descended the steps, his own boots polished to a mirror shine despite the early hour. "What's the count on the Maries?" 17 confirmed pregnant, sir. Should be a good foaling season come spring." Tom handed him a leather-bound ledger, thick with records and breeding charts. "Thunder's offspring are developing exactly as expected. Strong legs, good conformation, intelligent eyes. Thunder." Marcus smiled at the mention of his prize stallion, a magnificent beast with bloodlines that traced back to the finest Arabian stock. The horse had cost him more than most men made in 5 years, but he'd proven his worth 10 times over. Thunder's foals commanded premium prices across 3 territories, sought after by cavalry officers, wealthy ranchers, and anyone who understood quality horseflesh. Marcus opened the ledger to study the breeding charts, his finger tracing the intricate family trees that mapped out genetic perfection. Each line represented months of planning, careful selection, and substantial investment. He'd spent decades learning to read the subtle signs that distinguished a champion from merely good stock: the arch of the neck, the set of the shoulders, the fire in the eyes that spoke of spirit and endurance. "The Hendersons from Denver are coming next week to look at the bay colt," Tom continued. "They're willing to pay top dollar if he meets their standards. He will." Marcus closed the ledger with confidence. Every horse that bore the Caldwell brand met exacting standards. He built his reputation on consistency, on delivering exactly what he promised. Weakness, compromise, settling for less, these were luxuries he'd never allowed himself. The morning routine continued with military precision. Feed distribution at 6:30, pasture rotation schedules reviewed, equipment maintenance assigned, breeding schedules confirmed. Marcus moved through it all with the smooth efficiency of a man who'd eliminated every unnecessary motion from his daily life. His ranch hands respected him, perhaps feared him a little, but they also knew he was. Fair, work hard, follow instructions, maintain his standards, and you'd have steady employment and good wages. But respect and efficiency weren't enough anymore. Marcus felt it in quiet moments, a nagging incompleteness that no amount of success seemed to fill. At 52, he'd achieved everything he'd set out to accomplish. His horses were renowned throughout the West. His ranch was the model others tried to copy, and his bank account grew larger every year. Yet something essential remained missing. That something had a name. The perfect stallion to crown his life's work. Thunder was magnificent, but Thunder was also 12 years old, approaching the end of his prime breeding years. Marcus needed his successor, a horse so exceptional that it would cement the Caldwell legacy for generations. Not just good bloodlines or strong conformation, but that indefinable quality that separated the merely excellent from the truly legendary. He'd searched for 3 years, traveling to horse auctions from Kansas to California, consulting with breeders and traders across the frontier. Close calls, promising prospects, horses that were almost what he needed, but not quite. The perfect stallion remained elusive, like chasing shadows across the prairie. Then came the letter that changed everything. Arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a grizzled mountain man who claimed to have ridden 5 days to bring it personally. The envelope bore no return address, just Marcus's name written in careful script across expensive paper. Inside, a single sheet contained 12 words that made his heart race. I have what you seek. Come alone. Ask for old Pete. Devil's Canyon. Devil's Canyon. Marcus knew the name from stories told around campfires. A remote trading post deep in the Rocky Mountain wilderness where desperate men went to buy and sell things the law might question. He'd never been there himself, but he'd heard whispers of legendary horses appearing in those remote valleys, bloodlines so pure they could trace their ancestry to the great herds of ancient times. The letter bore no signature, no explanation of how the writer knew Marcus or his quest. But something about those 12 words carried a weight of truth that resonated in his bones. After 30 years of reading men and horses, Marcus had developed an instinct for authenticity. This wasn't another false lead or ambitious trader, overselling ordinary stock. He spent 2 days preparing for the journey, studying maps and calculating supplies. Devil's Canyon lay deep in uncharted territory, accessible only by treacherous mountain trails that would test both horse and rider. The trip would take at least a week each way, assuming good weather and no mishaps. It was dangerous, expensive, and possibly foolish. Marcus packed anyway. The silver pocket watch ticked steadily against his chest as he loaded his saddlebags with provisions, ammunition, and enough gold coins to purchase whatever miracle awaited him. This was his chance, perhaps his last chance, to find the missing piece that would complete his life's puzzle. The morning he departed, Tom Rodriguez watched from the barn doorway with obvious concern. You sure about this, Mr. Caldwell? That's rough country up there. A lot of things can go wrong. Marcus checked the cinch on his saddle one final time, then mounted his favorite riding horse, a reliable gelding named Sage, who'd carried him through countless miles of Colorado territory. Sometimes a man has to take risks to get what he really wants, Tom. Keep the ranch running smooth while I'm gone. I'll be back with our future. The silver watch marked 8 o'clock when he rode through the ranch's grand iron gates, past the brass nameplate that proclaimed Caldwell Ranch Est, 1845 finest horses in the territory. Behind him lay everything he'd built, everything that defined him. Ahead lay the unknown, and perhaps the culmination of everything he'd worked toward. As Sage's hooves found their rhythm on the mountain trail, Marcus allowed himself to dream of what awaited him in Devil's Canyon. A stallion with Thunder's intelligence, but greater strength. A horse with bloodlines so pure they glowed like legends. An animal that would father a dynasty and ensure the Caldwell name lived forever in the annals of Western horse breeding. He had no way of knowing that his dreams were about to be shattered by reality, or that the greatest lesson of his life would come from the most unlikely teachers imaginable. The trail to Devil's Canyon tested every skill Marcus had learned in 30 years of mountain riding. For 4 days, he and Sage picked their way through pine forests and across granite ridges, following paths that seemed to disappear and reappear like mirages. The air grew thinner with each mile of elevation, and the September nights carried the bite of approaching winter. On the 5th morning, Marcus finally glimpsed his destination. Devil's Canyon spread below him like a hidden world, its walls rising in sheer red stone cliffs that seemed to touch the sky. At the canyon's heart sat a cluster of weathered buildings that looked more like a collection of accidents than any planned settlement. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and Marcus could make out corrals and lean-to structures scattered among the rocks that the trading post itself defied description. Built into a natural cave formation, it seemed part of the mountain itself, with wooden additions tacked on wherever space allowed. A hand-painted sign proclaimed Old Pete's Trading Post horses, mules, and necessities in letters that had been touched up so many times they looked like layers of geological sediment. Marcus guided Sage down the treacherous switchback trail, his excitement building with each step. After days of anticipation, he was finally going to meet the man who claimed to have what he sought. The perfect stallion had to be here. No one would lure a buyer into such remote territory without something truly exceptional to offer. The first person he encountered was a toothless, old prospector leading a pack mule loaded with mining equipment. The man squinted at Marcus's fine clothes and well-kept horse with obvious suspicion. "You looking for something, mister?" "Old Pete. I'm here about a horse." The prospector spat tobacco juice onto the rocky ground. "Pete's in the back corral. But I'd be careful if I was you. He's got a strange sense of humor about what folks think they need." Marcus dismissed the warning as typical frontier superstition and made his way toward the sounds of snorting horses and jingling harness. The back of the trading post opened into a natural amphitheater surrounded by stone walls, with corrals carved from the living rock. The setup was crude but functional, providing shelter from wind while allowing plenty of space for animals dot and there. Sitting on a fence rail like he'd been waiting all morning was Old Pete. The man looked exactly like what Marcus expected from a legendary horse trader, weathered face mapped with lines that spoke of decades under the open sky. White hair that hadn't seen a barber in months, and eyes that seemed to look right through a person's pretenses. He wore buckskin clothes that had molded to his body through years of wear, and his boots showed the kind of patching that spoke of making do rather than making purchases. "You must be Caldwell," Pete said without preamble. "Heard you coming down the trail. That gelding of yours has a distinctive gait-slight favor of his left front foot. Old injury, I'd guess." Marcus dismounted and extended his hand. "You're remarkably well-informed, Mr. Pete. I received your letter about having what I seek." Pete's handshake was firm and brief. "Did I now? Interesting way to put it." He hopped down from the fence with surprising agility for a man who had to be pushing 70. "Come on, then. Let's see about your business." Instead of heading toward the corrals where Marcus could see several horses grazing, Pete walked toward a smaller enclosure tucked into a corner of the amphitheater. As they approached, Marcus felt his first flutter of unease. The animals in this pen were clearly not horses. "There she is," Pete announced with obvious pride. "Meet Rosie." Marcus stared in complete disbelief. Standing in the small corral was the most unremarkable donkey he'd ever seen. Gray with darker stripes, long ears that seemed too big for her head, and an expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Beside her stood a foal that looked like it might collapse if a strong wind came along all legs and ribs, with patches of white and brown fur that made it look like someone had started painting it and given up halfway through. There's been some mistake, Marcus said carefully, trying to maintain his composure. I'm looking for a stallion, a breeding animal. This is Rosie and her foal, Patches, Pete interrupted. Finest animals I've got. Rosie's got bloodlines going back to the Pharaohs, and Patches there has more heart per pound than any horse I've ever known. Marcus felt heat rising in his face. Sir, I rode 5 days through dangerous country because your letter claimed you had what I seek. I'm seeking a stallion to complete my breeding program. A horse of exceptional quality and bloodlines. This is a donkey and her foal. Pete finished with a slight smile. Yep, that's exactly what they are. The silence stretched between them like a taut rope. Marcus looked from Pete to the animals and back again, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate joke or a test of some kind. But Pete's expression remained serious, even expectant, as if he genuinely believed he was offering something valuable. Mr. Pete, Marcus said with forced patience. I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding. I breed champion horses. I have no use for donkeys, regardless of their alleged bloodlines or character. If you have horses for sale, I'd be happy to examine them. If not, these are what I have for sale, Pete said firmly. Take them or leave them. But I'll tell you something, Mr. Caldwell. You've spent so long looking at pedigree papers and bloodline charts that you've forgotten how to see what's really in front of you. Marcus felt his temper flare. After 5 days of hard riding, expenses, and anticipation, this was beyond insulting. What's in front of me is a jackass and her sickly offspring. I didn't travel across half of Colorado to be made a fool of. No, Pete agreed quietly. I don't expect you did. But maybe that's exactly what you need. The words hit Marcus like a slap. In 30 years of business, no one had dared speak to him with such casual dismissal of his expertise and judgment. Ranch hands jumped when he spoke. Horse traders courted his business, and competitors respected his reputation. This backwoods hermit was treating him like some greenhorn tourist. I'm leaving, Marcus announced. This has been a complete waste of time and money. He turned toward where he'd left Sage, anger burning hot in his chest. The whole trip had been a fool's errand, built on the fantasy that somewhere in the wilderness waited the perfect horse he'd been seeking. Instead, he'd found a crazy old man who thought he could pass off common donkeys as breeding stock. Mr. Caldwell. Something in Pete's tone made Marcus pause. He turned back to see the old trader studying him with an expression that wasn't mocking or dismissive, but oddly compassionate. Those animals aren't for sale, Pete said. They're a gift. From me to you. The question is whether you're man enough to accept what life's trying to give you. Marcus stared at him. A gift? You want to give me a donkey? I want to give you a chance to learn something you can't learn from breeding charts and bank statements. But I can't make you take it. Pete walked over to a small shed and emerged with a worn leather halter that looked like it had been repaired a dozen times. This is Rosie's halter. Been with her for 8 years. She's not much to look at, and she's got opinions about most. Everything, but she's got something your fancy horses don't have, which is wisdom. Pete held out the halter. Take them with you, Mr. Caldwell. Give them a chance to show you what they're worth. If you still think they're worthless after a week, turn them loose and go home. But if you're half the horseman you claim to be, you might learn something that'll change your life. Marcus looked at the halter, then at the donkey and foal. Rosie was watching him with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Patches had managed to find a patch of autumn grass and was nibbling contentedly, apparently unconcerned with the drama playing out around him. The rational part of Marcus's mind screamed that this was insane. He had a reputation to maintain, a business to run, and standards that didn't include hauling donkeys across the wilderness. But something else, some deeper instinct, whispered that walking away might be the biggest mistake of his life. Against his better judgment, Marcus took the halter. "1 week," he said firmly. "If they slow me down or cause problems, I'm turning them loose." Pete's smile was gentle and knowing. "Fair enough. But I think you'll find they're full of surprises." As Marcus led Rosie from the corral, Patches following. Close behind his mother, he caught Pete watching with an expression of quiet satisfaction. The old trader raised his hand in farewell as Marcus began leading his unlikely caravan toward the trail out of Devil's Canyon. The silver pocket watch in Marcus's vest ticked steadily as he started the long journey home, marking time toward reckoning he couldn't yet imagine. The trail out of Devil's Canyon proved even more treacherous than the descent. Marcus rode Sage while leading Rosie, who seemed determined to investigate every rock, bush, and interesting smell along the way. Behind them, Patches struggled to keep up on legs that looked too long and unsteady for his small body. The Foal, and wrapped around him a makeshift blanket, a piece of torn canvas that old Pete had insisted he'd need. For the first hour, Marcus's irritation grew with each step. Rosie moved at her own pace, completely ignoring his attempts to hurry her along. When he pulled on her lead rope, she simply planted her feet and stared at him with those dark, patient eyes until he gave up and let her proceed at her chosen speed. Patches, meanwhile, seemed to find energy in bursts, trotting gamely for 50 yards before dropping back to a walk that threatened to become a stop. "This is exactly what I expected," Marcus muttered to Sage, who flicked his ears sympathetically. "Should have listened to my first instinct and left them in that corral." By mid-afternoon, they'd covered perhaps half the distance Marcus usually traveled in a morning. The September sky, which had been clear and bright when they started, now showed gathering clouds along the western peaks. Mountain weather was notoriously unpredictable, and those clouds carried the heavy look of serious precipitation. Marcus checked his pocket watch and felt his first real stab of concern. At this pace, they'd be caught in the open when the storm hit. The trail ahead offered little shelter, just exposed switchbacks across, bare rock faces that would become deadly in wind and rain. As if sensing his thoughts, Patches suddenly stumbled and went down hard, the canvas blanket tangling around his legs. The Foal lay still for a moment, sides heaving with exhaustion, and Marcus felt a surprising surge of worry. The little animal was clearly at the end of his strength. Marcus dismounted and knelt beside the Foal. Patches looked up at him with eyes that seemed too large and knowing for such a young creature. The Foal's breathing was labored, and his small body shook with fatigue and cold. "Come on, little fellow," Marcus said quietly, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. He untangled the blanket and wrapped it more securely around Patches, then helped the Foal to his feet. "We need to find shelter before this weather turns ugly." Rosie had stopped the moment her foal went down, and now she moved close to nuzzle Patches with obvious concern. The love between mother and child was unmistakable, and it stirred something in Marcus that he'd kept buried for years. He'd never had children, never allowed time for the relationships that might have led to a family. His horses had been his legacy, his ranch his monument. But watching Rosie care for her vulnerable foal, he felt an echo of what he'd missed. First raindrops began falling as they resumed their slow progress. Within minutes, the drops became a steady drizzle that turned the rocky trail treacherous. Marcus's fine clothes, designed for business meetings and ranch inspections, offered little protection against the mountain weather. Water ran down his neck and soaked through his shirt, while his polished boots struggled for purchase on the whetstone. Ahead, the trail curved around a massive boulder formation, and Marcus hoped to find some overhang or cave where they could wait out the storm. Instead, he found himself looking at a sheer drop-off where the trail simply ended. Recent rock slides had torn away the path, leaving a gap too wide to cross and too deep to survive. "Well, that's just perfect," he said aloud, rainwater streaming from his hat brim. They were trapped, couldn't go forward, couldn't make it back to Devil's Canyon before full darkness. And the weather was getting worse by the minute. That's when Rosie did something that changed everything. Instead of stopping at the barrier, she turned off the main trail and began picking her way down what looked like a game path carved into the cliff face. The route was barely visible, certainly not meant for humans, but Rosie moved with confidence. Steps as if she'd traveled it before. Marcus hesitated. Following an animal trail in good weather was one thing, but in a storm, with a sick foal and valuable horses at stake, it seemed like madness. Yet as the rain intensified and lightning began flickering in the distance, staying put seemed equally dangerous. "What do you think, Sage?" he asked his gelding. The horse snorted and shook water from his mane, clearly unhappy with the whole situation. Patches made the decision for them. The little foal began following his mother down the narrow path, moving with more sureness than he'd shown all day. Whatever strength he'd been saving, he was using now, as if he understood their survival depended on finding shelter. Marcus had no choice but to follow. Leading Sage carefully, he began the descent down what felt like the edge of the world. The path wound through rock formations and stunted pines, barely wide enough for the horses. One wrong step would send them all tumbling into the void, but Rosie seemed to know exactly where she was going. She moved with the steady confidence of an animal following ancient trails, pausing occasionally to let Patches catch up, but never hesitating about the route. Her sure-footed navigation through terrain that challenged Marcus's experienced riding skills forced him to admit that there was more to this donkey than he'd initially recognized. 20 minutes of careful descent brought them to a natural shelf, protected by an overhanging cliff, a perfect shelter from the storm that was now raging in earnest above them. Wind howled through the canyon, but their refuge remained calm and dry. A small seep in the rock wall provided fresh water, and scattered pine needles made a soft bed for the animals. Marcus stripped the saddles and packs from the horses, then helped settle Patches in the driest corner of the shelter. The foal was exhausted but seemed stronger now that he was out of the storm. Rosie positioned herself between her baby and the cave opening, a guardian against whatever the night might bring. As full darkness settled over the mountains, Marcus built a small fire from dead wood scattered around the shelter. The flames cast dancing shadows on the stone walls and filled their refuge with welcome warmth. For the first time since leaving Devil's Canyon, he felt safe. Sitting by the fire with his back against the stone wall, Marcus found himself really looking at his companions for the first time. Rosie was indeed unremarkable by conventional standards, sturdy rather than elegant, practical rather than beautiful. But there was an intelligence in her eyes that spoke of wisdom earned through experience, and her devotion to Patches revealed a depth of character that transcended mere appearance. Patches, meanwhile, seemed to be recovering from his earlier collapse. The warmth of the fire and his mother's presence had restored some energy, and he was actually playing chasing shadows on the cave wall and investigating interesting smells with the curiosity of any young animal. "I guess I owe you an apology," Marcus said quietly to Rosie. "You found a shelter when I couldn't see past the end of my own nose." The donkey looked at him with those patient, knowing eyes, and Marcus could have sworn she nodded slightly before returning her attention to grooming Patches. As the storm raged outside their sanctuary, Marcus pulled out his pocket watch and checked the time. 9 o'clock. They should have been miles closer to home by now. His schedule was ruined, his plans disrupted, and he was sharing a cave with two animals he'd never wanted in the first place. Yet sitting by the fire, listening to the storm and watching the gentle interaction between mother and foal, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the satisfaction of a successful business deal or the pride of a well-managed ranch, but simple contentment with the present moment. Perhaps old Pete had been right about these animals being full of surprises. Marcus woke to silence and the pale light of dawn filtering through the cave opening. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling with moisture. He sat up, joints stiff from sleeping on stone, and checked his leather-bound journal, where he kept meticulous records of every business transaction and breeding decision. The pages were damp but readable, filled with columns of numbers, genetic charts, and profit projections that had dominated his thoughts for decades. Looking at them now, in this primitive shelter with his unlikely companions, the entry seemed to belong to a different life entirely. Patches was already awake, exploring the cave with the endless curiosity of youth. His legs looked steadier this morning, and the spark in his eyes suggested the rest had done him good. Rosie watched her foal's adventures with maternal patience, occasionally nickering softly when he wandered too close to the cave entrance. Marcus stepped outside to assess their situation and immediately understood why Rosie had seemed so confident about finding this shelter. The game trail continued beyond their refuge, winding down through pine and aspen groves toward what looked like a hidden valley. More importantly, he could see where it reconnected with the main trail several miles below the washout that had blocked their progress. "Looks like you knew exactly what you were doing," he said to Rosie, who had followed him to the cave entrance. The donkey regarded him with what he could only interpret as smug satisfaction, but as they prepared to continue their journey, Marcus discovered the full extent of their predicament. The storm had been worse than he'd realized. Through his spyglass, he could see that multiple sections of the main trail had been washed away. Even if they could navigate around the immediate obstacles, the route home would require extensive detours through terrain he didn't know. His supplies, planned for a week-long round trip, now looked dangerously inadequate. Water wouldn't be a problem. Mountain streams were plentiful, but food was another matter. He'd brought grain for Sage and provisions for himself, but nothing suitable for a donkey and foal who would need different nutrition than his well-conditioned riding horse. More troubling still was Patches's condition. The little foal had rallied during their night of rest, but he was still weak from whatever illness or malnourishment had left him so frail. The hard travel ahead might be more than his small body could handle. Marcus found himself facing a decision he'd never expected to confront. He could abandon the donkeys here and push ahead with just Sage, making better time and conserving supplies. It would be the practical choice, the business decision his ranch hands would expect from him. He'd tried to help. Circumstances had made it impossible, and no reasonable person would blame him for prioritizing his own survival. But as he watched Patches nuzzle against his mother's flank, seeking comfort and reassurance, Marcus discovered he couldn't bring himself to walk away. These weren't just animals anymore. They were individuals with personalities, relationships, and a trust in him that he found himself reluctant to betray. "Looks like we're in this together," he told them, surprised by his own decision. "But we're going to have to be smart about it." The descent into the hidden valley revealed wonders Marcus had never imagined existed in these mountains. Ancient trees grew to enormous size in the protected basin, their canopy so thick it created a cathedral-like atmosphere. Streams meandered through meadows thick with grass, and the whole valley seemed untouched by human presence. More importantly, it was clearly donkey paradise. Rosie moved through the landscape like she'd come home, leading them to the best grazing spots, the cleanest water, and paths that wound through the terrain with surprising efficiency. Her knowledge of the country became increasingly apparent as the day progressed. She knew where to find shelter from the wind, which plants were safe to eat, and how to navigate obstacles that would have challenged an experienced mountain guide. Patches, meanwhile, began to flourish in this environment. The good grass and clean water seemed to restore his strength hour by hour, and his playful nature emerged as his health improved. He chased butterflies, investigated interesting rocks, and displayed the kind of joyful energy that Marcus remembered from the foals on his own ranch before business concerns had made him too busy to simply watch young animals play dot by evening. They'd made better progress than Marcus had thought possible. The hidden valley connected to another drainage that would eventually lead them back toward familiar territory, though by a much longer route than he'd originally planned. More importantly, both donkeys seemed stronger and happier than when they'd started dot as they made camp beside a crystal-clear stream. Marcus found himself talking to his companions in a way he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. Not the careful, measured words he used in business negotiations or the curt instructions he gave his ranch hands, but the kind of rambling, comfortable conversation he might have shared with old friends. "You know," he said to Rosie as he filled his water bottles, "I spent 3 years looking for the perfect stallion. Traveled to auctions from Kansas to California, studied bloodlines until my eyes burned, calculated genetic probabilities like I was solving mathematical equations. In all that time, I never once asked myself what I was really looking for." Rosie continued grazing, but her ears swiveled toward him in a way that suggested she was listening. "I thought I wanted perfection," Marcus continued, settling back against a fallen log. "A horse so magnificent that everyone would look at him and know I'd achieved something special. But sitting here with you two, I'm starting to wonder if I added backwards." Patches wandered over and sniffed curiously at Marcus's boots before settling down beside him. The foal's trust was complete and unquestioning, the kind of faith that Marcus realized he'd forgotten how to inspire in the humans around him. As the stars emerged in the clear mountain sky, Marcus pulled out his journal and began writing not breeding records or profit calculations, but simple observations about the day. Patches' growing strength, Rosie's uncanny navigation skills, the beauty of the hidden valley they'd discovered. For the first time in decades, he was recording experiences rather than just transactions. The leather-bound book felt different in his hands now, less like a business ledger and more like what it could become, a record of genuine moments and real relationships. He thought about his ranch hands, efficient and respectful but distant. He thought about his business associates, professional but never personal. He thought about his grand house with its imported furniture and expensive decorations, beautiful, but somehow empty. Looking up from the journal, Marcus watched Rosie and Patches grazing peacefully in the moonlight. Mother and child, completely content in each other's company, finding richness in simple pleasures that money couldn't buy. They possessed something he'd somehow lost in his climb toward success, the ability to be present in the moment, to find joy in everyday experiences, to value relationships over achievements. "Maybe old Pete was right," he said quietly. "Maybe I did need to learn something I couldn't learn from breeding charts and bank statements." The silver pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, marking time that suddenly felt less like a commodity to be managed and more like a gift to be appreciated. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and continued uncertainty. But tonight, sitting beside a mountain stream with his unlikely companions, Marcus Caldwell felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Simple happiness. For a man who'd spent 30 years building an empire based on perfection, it was a startling discovery to realize that contentment might be found in the most imperfect circumstances imaginable. 3 days of traveling through the hidden valleys had transformed their unlikely caravan into something resembling a family. Marcus found himself looking forward to the morning ritual of breaking camp, not because it brought him closer to home, but because it meant another day of discovery with companions who surprised him at every. Turned out his supplies were running dangerously low, but somehow Rosie always seemed to know where to find the resources they needed. She led them to berry patches heavy with late-season fruit, to meadows where wild onions grew thick, and to streams where mountain trout gathered in pools so clear Marcus could count the pebbles on the bottom. The donkey's knowledge of the wilderness was encyclopedic, passed down through generations of survival wisdom that no breeding chart could capture. Patches had grown stronger each day, his legs steadier and his coat beginning to show the lustrous health that comes from good food and clean mountain air. The foal's personality was emerging too curious about everything, fearless in his exploration, and possessed of an intelligence that manifested in unexpected ways. He'd learned to anticipate trail obstacles, to find the safest paths across rocky terrain, and to communicate his needs with a vocabulary of sounds that Marcus was beginning to understand. But it was during their fourth evening together that Marcus discovered something that would haunt him for years to come. While rummaging through his saddlebags for his few remaining provisions, his fingers found something he'd forgotten. Was there a faded family photograph, creased and worn from years of being carried but never looked at. The image showed a younger Marcus, perhaps 12 years old, standing beside his family's old mule, Jeremiah. Behind them was the modest farm where he'd grown up, a far cry from the grand ranch he now owned. His father stood with one weathered hand on Marcus's shoulder. His mother smiled from the farmhouse doorway, and young Marcus grinned with the uncomplicated joy of a boy who measured wealth in adventures rather than acres. Jeremiah had been his closest companion during those early years. Not a beautiful animal by any standard, gray and stubborn and prone to opinions about most everything, but possessed of a loyalty and wisdom that had seen the family through countless hardships. When drought killed their crops, Jeremiah hauled water from distant springs. When winter storms threatened their livestock, the old mule led the other animals to shelter with an instinct that saved them all. Marcus studied the photograph by firelight, remembering things he'd spent decades trying to forget, the poverty that had driven him to succeed, the humiliation of wearing patched clothes and riding a mule while richer families displayed their wealth through fine horses and expensive tack. The burning determination to never be poor again, never be laughed at, never be considered less than anyone else. Jeremiah had died during Marcus's 15th year, worn out from a lifetime of hard work and faithful service. Marcus had grieved for exactly one day, then announced his intention to buy a proper horse as soon as he could afford one. His father had tried to explain that the mule's value couldn't be measured in dollars, but Marcus had been too young and too ambitious to listen. Now, sitting beside a mountain stream with Rosie and Patches sleeping nearby, Marcus finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him. Jeremiah's worth hadn't been in his appearance or pedigree, but in his character. The old mule had possessed something Marcus had spent 30 years trying to buy: the ability to find joy in simple work, to love without expectation of reward, and to measure success by the welfare of those he cared about. "I was such a fool," he whispered to the photograph. "I spent my whole life running from what I should have been running toward." Rosie opened one eye and looked at him with that patient, knowing expression that reminded him so strongly of Jeremiah, it made his chest tight. She seemed to understand that he was wrestling with something important, because she didn't return to sleep but instead moved closer, offering the comfort of her presence without demanding anything in return. Marcus tucked the photograph back into his saddlebag, but he couldn't put away the memories it had awakened. He thought about the ranch hands who worked for him, good men who maintained respectful distances because he'd never invited anything more personal. He thought about the neighbors who admired his success but didn't consider him a friend. He thought about the beautiful, empty house that showcased his wealth but had never heard the laughter of children or the comfortable conversation of genuine companionship. The silver pocket watch ticked against his chest, marking time that felt increasingly precious as he realized how much of it he'd wasted pursuing the wrong goals. Success had cost him more than he'd ever calculated, not in dollars or effort, but in the relationships and simple pleasures that made life worth living. Over the following days, as they continued their slow progress toward home, Marcus found himself sharing stories with his companions that he'd never told anyone. Tales of his childhood with Jeremiah, memories of his parents' quiet wisdom, dreams he'd abandoned in pursuit of respectability and wealth. Rosie and Patches listened without judgment, their presence somehow making it safe to admit truths he'd spent years denying even to himself. The donkeys, meanwhile, continued to demonstrate their own remarkable qualities. When a mountain lion's scream echoed through their camp one night, Rosie positioned herself between the threat and her family, her normally gentle demeanor replaced by fierce protectiveness. Patches, despite his youth, showed courage beyond his size, standing close to his mother and facing the darkness with the kind of quiet bravery that couldn't be taught. When they encountered a swollen stream that blocked their path, Rosie found a safe crossing that Sage wouldn't have attempted without her guidance. A sure feet and intimate knowledge of water conditions made the difference between progress and disaster. Marcus realized he'd been thinking backwards about leadership. It wasn't about commanding others to follow, but about earning the trust that made them willing to follow Dodd as they climbed toward the high passes that would eventually lead them home. Marcus felt a growing reluctance to end this journey. The wilderness had stripped away the pretenses and complications of his normal life, revealing truths about himself that he wasn't sure he was ready to face in the context of his old routines and expectations. His grand ranch, his prize horses, his reputation as the territory's premier breeder, all of it suddenly seemed less important than the simple pleasure of watching Patches discover new sights and sounds, or the quiet satisfaction of earning Rosie's trust through consistent kindness. These animals had given him something more valuable than any stallion could provide, a glimpse of the man he might have become if he hadn't been so afraid of being poor that he'd forgotten how to be rich in the ways that actually mattered. The photograph in his saddlebag seemed to grow heavier with each mile, carrying the weight of choices made and opportunities missed. But it also carried hope, the possibility that understanding his mistakes might not be too late to change his future. On their 7th day together, Marcus faced a reckoning that would define the rest of their journey. They had climbed steadily toward the high country, following game trails and ancient paths that seemed to exist in Rosie's memory rather than on any map. The donkey's knowledge of the mountains continued to astound him. She knew where to find grass when the terrain looked barren, where to locate water when streams disappeared, and how to navigate terrain that would challenge the most experienced guide. Thunder's golden bridle, the most expensive piece of tack Marcus owned, had begun to tarnish in the mountain weather. The ornate metalwork, which had always symbolized his success and status, now looked garish against the simple beauty of their wilderness surroundings. Each time he polished it during their evening camps, the shine seemed to fade faster, as if the mountains themselves were teaching him about the difference between genuine value and mere appearance. Patches had grown visibly stronger over the week, his legs more steady, and his coat beginning to show the health that comes from good food and freedom. But more than his physical improvement, the little Foal's spirit had blossomed in ways that touched something deep in Marcus's heart. Patches approached each day with the kind of joy that Marcus remembered from his own childhood, curious about everything, delighted by simple discoveries, unencumbered by worries about tomorrow. The morning brought their greatest challenge yet. The trail they'd been following ended abruptly at the edge of a massive rock slide that blocked the entire valley. Tons of granite had cascaded down from the peaks above, creating a barrier that looked impossible to cross. The slide was too steep to climb, too wide to go around, and too unstable to risk attempting with the animals. Marcus studied the obstacle through his spyglass, searching for any alternative route. To the north, sheer cliffs rose for thousands of feet. To the south, the mountainside dropped away into canyons too deep to descend safely. Behind them lay days of travel through country they'd already crossed, with supplies that wouldn't last for a return journey. For the first time since leaving Devil's Canyon, Marcus felt the cold touch of real fear. They were trapped in high country, with winter approaching, limited food, and no clear path forward. His pocket watch seemed to tick louder in the thin air, counting down toward a deadline he didn't want to contemplate. "Well, Rosie," he said aloud, his breath making clouds in the cold mountain air, "I think we've finally found something that even you can't figure out." But the donkey didn't seem discouraged. Instead of turning back or standing defeated at the base of the rock slide, she began working her way along its edge, nose to the ground like she was following a scent. Patches stayed close beside her, matching his mother's methodical pace as they examined what looked like an impassable wall of stoned-out. Marcus watched them with growing amazement. Where he saw only obstacles, Rosie seemed to see possibilities. She investigated crevices, tested loose rocks with her hooves, and gradually worked her way toward what looked like a slightly less vertical section of the slide. After an hour of careful exploration, she stopped at a spot that looked no different from any other to Marcus's eyes. But something about the way she positioned herself, the confident set of her ears, suggested she'd found what she was looking for. Marcus dismounted and scrambled up to where she stood. Looking closer, he could see what had caught her attention, a narrow ledge that had been hidden by the angle of view from below, barely wide enough for a single animal but offering a possible route across the slide. The path was terrifying. It required crossing hundreds of feet of unstable scree on a ledge that in some places was only inches wide. One loose rock, one moment of lost balance, and the fall would kill any creature that tried it. But it was also their only chance. "You can't be serious," Marcus said to Rosie. "That's not a trail. It's suicide." Rosie looked at him with those patient, intelligent eyes, then began the crossing. Marcus watched in horrified fascination as the donkey picked her way across the rock slide with the precision of a tightrope walker. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. She tested each foothold before committing her weight, navigated around the most unstable sections, and maintained perfect balance even when loose stones cascaded into the void below. Patches followed his mother with the absolute trust that only the young possess, his small hooves finding purchase in spots that seemed too narrow to support even his slight weight. The foal showed no fear, only confidence in his mother's judgment and his own growing abilities. When both donkeys reached the far side safely, they turned to look back at Marcus and Sage with expressions that seemed to say, "Well, are you coming? Or not?" Marcus stared across the terrifying traverse, his mouth dry with fear. In 30 years of mountain travel, he'd never attempted anything half as dangerous. Every instinct screamed at him to find another way, to turn back, to choose safety over the unknown. But as he watched Rosie and Patches waiting patiently on the far side, he realized this was about more than just crossing a rock slide. This was about trust in abilities beyond his own understanding, trust in the wisdom of creatures he'd initially dismissed as worthless, trust in the possibility that there were paths through life's obstacles that couldn't be found in any guidebook or calculated by any formula. "Come on, Sage," he said quietly to his horse. "If a donkey and a foal can do it, I guess we can too." The crossing took 45 minutes that felt like hours. Every step was a conscious decision to continue trusting in Rosie's judgment rather than his own fear. The golden bridle caught on rocks and had to be constantly adjusted. It's ornate, designed more hindrance than help in the brutal simplicity of survival. By the time they reached the far side, Marcus was shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline, but also with something else, a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with business success or material gain. As they regrouped on safe ground beyond the slide, Marcus found himself looking at his companions with new respect. These weren't just animals he was helping. They were guides leading him through territory he never could have navigated alone. Rosie possessed a kind of wisdom that couldn't be bought or bred, only earned through experience and refined by necessity. Patches, despite his youth, showed the kind of courage that came from trusting in something greater than himself. The golden bridle, now bent and scratched from its ordeal, seemed to catch the afternoon light differently. Its shine was diminished, but somehow it looked more honest, less like a display of wealth, and more like a tool shaped by use. Marcus realized he was changing too, becoming less polished but perhaps more genuine, trading surface perfection for authentic experience. That evening, as they camped in a protected valley beyond the slide, Marcus wrote in his journal about lessons learned from teachers he never expected to have. The leather-bound book that had once contained only breeding records and profit calculations now held observations about courage, trust, and the difference between knowing the price of everything and understanding the value of anything. The silver pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, but its rhythm no longer felt like pressure to hurry toward predetermined goals. Instead, it seemed to be counting moments of genuine experience, measuring time in discoveries rather than transactions. For a man who had spent decades believing that worth could be calculated in dollars and bloodlines, it was a revelation to discover that the most valuable lessons couldn't be purchased at any price. On their 9th morning together, as Marcus was repacking Rosie's worn saddlebags after another night of mountain camping, his fingers discovered something that shouldn't have been there. Tucked deep into his side pocket, he'd never bothered to explore, was a folded piece of paper, sealed with wax and bearing his name in the same careful script he'd seen on the original letter that brought him to Devil's Canyon. Marcus broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded what turned out to be a detailed letter from old Pete. As he read, his understanding of everything that had happened over the past week crumbled and reformed into a pattern so unexpected it left him breathless. "Mr. Caldwell," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've gotten far enough along the trail to discover what I hoped you would. By now, you've probably figured out that Rosie and Patches aren't the disappointment you first took them for. But there's more you need to know. More than I could tell you face to face, because you wouldn't have believed it coming from a crazy old hermit in the wilderness. I've been watching you for 3 years, Marcus. Not spying, exactly, but paying attention. Word travels fast in the horse trading business, and your name comes up in every conversation about quality breeding stock. But other names come up too, in different kinds of conversations. Your ranch hands talk when they come to town for supplies. Your neighbors share stories at the general store. Your business associates mention things over whiskey that they'd never say to your face. What I heard was the portrait of a man who'd forgotten how to live while he was busy learning how to succeed. A man so focused on perfection that he'd lost sight of what makes anything worth perfecting in the first place. A man who owned everything he wanted, but had somehow missed getting anything he actually needed. That's when I started making inquiries about your past. Wasn't hard to find people who remembered the Caldwell boy who grew up poor on the hardscrabble farm with the old mule. Neighbors who recalled how that boy used to light up whenever he was working with Jeremiah, how he'd talk to that mule like it was his best friend, how he'd defend the animal against anyone who made jokes about their poverty. I found your old neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. She's 92 now, living with her daughter in Denver, but her memory is sharp as a tack. She told me stories about you that I bet you've tried to forget. How you cried for 3 days when Jeremiah died. How you vowed never to love another animal that way because it hurt too much when you lost them. How you decided that if you couldn't afford to keep what you loved, you'd get rich enough to buy what you wanted instead. Mrs. Henderson said she watched you turn yourself into somebody else, somebody harder and more distant, somebody who measured everything by its price tag and nothing by its heart. She said it was like watching a bright flame slowly dim itself down until there was nothing left but efficient heat. That's when I knew what you needed, Marcus. Not another horse to add to your collection, but a chance to remember who you used to be before you got so afraid of being hurt that you forgot how to be happy. Rosie isn't just any donkey. She's Jeremiah's great-granddaughter. I tracked down her bloodline through 3 generations of mountain traders who recognized quality when they saw it, even in humble packages. She carries the same genes that made Jeremiah so special, the same intelligence and loyalty and wisdom that you learn to love before you learn to be ashamed of loving it. Patches is special too, but not because of his bloodlines. He's special because he's been sick and weak and dependent on others for his survival. Just like you were once, before you got strong enough to convince yourself that needing anybody was a weakness you couldn't afford. I gave them to you because I hoped that if you spent enough time with them, you might remember what it felt like to love something, not for what it could do for you, but for what it already was. I thought maybe if you had to depend on them for a while, you might recall that the strongest people are those who know how to accept help when they need it. I know this is going to make you angry, Marcus. You don't like being manipulated, and you especially don't like being seen through by somebody you barely know. But I'm old enough that making people comfortable matters less to me than making them think. And I figured if I was going to meddle in somebody's life, it might as well be somebody who had enough good left in him to be worth saving. By the time you read this, you'll have spent over a week learning to see the world through Rosie's eyes. You'll have watched Patches grow stronger and braver under his mother's patient care. You'll have discovered that the animals you thought were worthless possess qualities that money can't buy and breeding charts can't measure. The question now is what you're going to do with what you've learned. You can go back to your ranch and your prize horses and your carefully calculated life, treating this week as an interesting adventure that doesn't change anything important. Or you can let it change everything. I hope you choose the second path, Marcus, not for my sake, but for yours. Because the man who used to love an old mule named Jeremiah deserves to be happy. And happiness isn't something you can purchase or breed or manage into existence. It's something you have to allow yourself to feel, even when it makes you vulnerable, even when it opens you up to loss. Rosie and Patches are yours now, no conditions attached. But they're not really a gift from me to you. They're a gift from the man you used to be to the man you might become again, if you're brave enough to let it happen. I hope this finds you well and thinking hard about what really matters. Your friend, whether you want one or not, Pete Morrison. Peace. The trail you're on will take you home by way of Miller's Pass. It's longer than the direct route, but sometimes the longer way teaches you things the shorter way never could. Marcus. Read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. Everything he'd experienced over the past week, every challenge, every revelation, every moment of growing connection with these animals had been orchestrated by a man who saw through his carefully constructed persona to the lonely reality. Underneath, his first reaction was fury. How dare this stranger manipulate him, study his life like a specimen, decide what he needed without asking his permission. The presumption was outrageous, the violation of his privacy inexcusable. But as his anger cooled, other emotions crowded in to replace it. Embarrassment and how transparent his loneliness had apparently been to everyone except himself. Amazement at the elaborate care Pete had taken to engineer this encounter. Wonder at the depth of thought and compassion that had gone into choosing exactly the right teachers for lessons he desperately needed to learn. Most unsettling of all was the realization that Pete had been right about everything. The patterns he'd identified, the emptiness he'd diagnosed, the solution he'd prescribed, all of it was accurate in ways that made Marcus squirm with uncomfortable self-recognition. He looked at Rosie, who was grazing peacefully nearby, and tried to see Jeremiah's legacy in her sturdy frame and intelligent eyes. The resemblance had always been there, but he'd been too busy being disappointed to notice it. Now it seemed obvious, the same patient wisdom, the same gentle strength, the same uncanny ability to find paths through impossible terrain. Patches looked up from his mourning, exploration of interesting rocks, and trotted over to investigate what Marcus was holding. The foal's curiosity was guileless and complete, unmarked by the suspicion or calculation that had come to characterize most of Marcus's human relationships. "So you're both part of an elaborate lesson plan," Marcus said to them. "How do you feel about being used as teaching tools by a meddling old man?" Rosie lifted her head from the grass and regarded him with an expression that seemed to say, "Does it matter why we are here if being here is where we all need to be?" Marcus folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his journal beside this faded photograph of himself with Jeremiah. Two pieces of paper that told the story of a man who'd lost his way and been given a chance to find it again, if he was brave enough to accept the gift. The silver pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, measuring moments that suddenly felt weighted with possibility rather than obligation. He could choose anger at being manipulated, or gratitude for being seen clearly enough to be helped. He could cling to his pride and independence, or acknowledge that sometimes the best gifts come from unexpected sources. Looking at Rosie and Patches, seeing them now not as random animals he'd been saddled with, but as carefully chosen companions selected specifically for what they could teach him, Marcus felt something shift deep in his chest. It was like a door opening onto possibilities he'd forgotten existed, or maybe never known were there. Pete Morrison had gambled that beneath 30 years of emotional armor lived a man worth saving. Now Marcus had to decide whether that gamble would pay off. The final 2 days of their journey took on the weight of a pilgrimage. Marcus found himself moving more slowly than necessary, reluctant to reach the end of a transformation that felt incomplete. Pete's letter had reframed everything he thought he understood about the past week, but it had also presented him with a choice that would define the rest of his life. Miller's path stretched ahead of them through country that grew increasingly familiar as they descended from the high peaks toward the rolling hills of home. Each landmark they passed the distinctive twin pines that marked the territorial boundary, the weathered rock formation known as Eagle's Perch. The meadow where he'd once found a lost calf brought him closer to the moment when he would have to reconcile the man he'd become in the wilderness with the man he'd been before. Patches had undergone his own transformation over their time together. The sickly foal who'd barely been able to keep up that first day had developed into a strong, confident young animal with bright eyes and a playful spirit. Watching him discover the world with unbounded curiosity, Marcus marveled at the resilience of youth and the healing power of patient care. The little foal had learned to navigate the most challenging terrain with surprising skill. When they encountered a fallen log blocking their path, Patches approached it not as an obstacle, but as an adventure. His first attempt at jumping cleared the log easily, and the pride in his achievement was unmistakable. He pranced and kicked his heels in celebration, then looked to Marcus and Rosie for acknowledgement of his success. "Well done, little fellow," Marcus said, and realized he meant it in ways that went far beyond simple encouragement. There was something profound about witnessing Patches overcome a challenge through determination and trust in his own abilities. It represented the kind of small victory that Marcus had stopped noticing in his relentless pursuit of grand achievements. Rosie, meanwhile, continued to demonstrate the deep wisdom that had guided them safely through every challenge of their journey. Her knowledge of the country seemed limitless, but more than that, her understanding of what her companions needed went beyond mere survival. She had somehow known exactly when to push them forward and when to allow them to rest, when to lead confidently and when to wait patiently for them to find their own way. As they made camp on their final night before reaching home, Marcus sat by the fire and tried to imagine returning to his old life. The grand ranch house with its imported furniture and expensive decorations. The efficient operation run by respectful but distant employees. The business meetings focused solely on profit margins and breeding statistics. The solitary evenings spent reviewing ledgers and planning acquisitions that would add to his wealth, but not to his happiness. The image felt like putting on clothes that no longer fit properly technically possible, but profoundly uncomfortable. I don't know if I can go back to the way things were, he confessed to Rosie as she grazed nearby. But I'm not sure I know how to change either. 30 years of habits don't disappear overnight. The donkey looked up from her grazing with that patient, knowing expression that had become so familiar over their time together. In her eyes, Marcus saw neither judgment nor pressure, only acceptance of whatever choice he would make. That night, he dreamed of Jeremiah. The old mule appeared as Marcus remembered him from childhood, steady, patient, unconditionally loyal. In the dream, they were working together to repair a section of fence that kept falling down no matter how many times they fixed it. The problem isn't with the fence, Jeremiah said in the strange way that dreams allow animals to speak. The problem is that you keep trying to build it the same way, expecting different results. How else can I build it? Dream Marcus asked. With different materials, different methods, different intentions. The mule's voice carried the wisdom of years and the gentleness of true understanding. You've been building walls when what you need are bridges. Marcus woke to the sound of morning birdsong and the sight of sunrise painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose. The dream's message resonated with crystalline clarity. He couldn't create a new life using the same approaches that had built his old one. Change would require not just different actions, but different ways of thinking about what actions were worth taking. As they broke camp and began the final leg of their journey, Marcus made a series of small decisions that felt like steps toward a larger commitment. Instead of pushing for maximum speed to reach home quickly, he matched his pace to Patch's natural rhythm, allowing the young foal to explore interesting sights without feeling rushed. Instead of reviewing business problems in his mind, as he usually did during travel, he paid attention to the country they were passing through, noticing details he'd missed in years of hurried trips focused only on destinations. When they crested the final ridge before home, Marcus pulled up short at his first glimpse of Caldwell Ranch spread out in the valley below. From this distance, it looked like a picture postcard of success: neat fences, prosperous buildings, well-maintained pastures dotted with valuable horses. Everything a man could want, built through decades of careful planning and relentless work. But looking at it now, Marcus saw something else. A beautiful, empty monument to achievement without purpose. All that wealth and efficiency serving no goal beyond its own perpetuation. All those impressive horses bred for perfection that would be admired, sold, and forgotten, leaving no mark on the world beyond their contribution to someone else's profit. Margins, what do you think? He asked Rosie and Patches. Ready to see your new home? Rosie studied the ranch below with the analytical gaze she'd used to evaluate mountain trails and river crossings. Her assessment seemed cautiously positive. Good grass, clean water, adequate shelter. But Marcus thought he detected something else in her expression, a reservation that suggested she understood this place represented challenges different from those they'd faced in the wilderness. Patches, meanwhile, seemed excited by the prospect of exploring new territory. His ears pricked forward as he took in the sights and sounds of the ranch, and he stepped eagerly down the trail toward whatever adventures awaited him. As they descended toward home, Marcus felt the weight of approaching decision. The next few hours would determine whether their journey had been merely an interesting interlude or the beginning of fundamental change. The man who had left Caldwell Ranch 2 weeks ago in search of the perfect stallion was gone, replaced by someone who understood that perfection might not be the point. The silver pocket watch in his vest ticked steadily, but its rhythm no longer felt like countdown to deadline. Instead, it seemed to be marking the approach of a new beginning, time measured not in productivity and profit, but in possibilities for authentic connection and genuine happiness. The grand iron gates of Caldwell Ranch came into view, their brass nameplate gleaming in the afternoon sun. Beyond them lay everything he had built over 30 years of focused ambition. Behind him stretched the trail that had taught him to value things that couldn't be bought or bred or managed into existence. The question was whether he could bring the lessons of the trail into the world of the ranch, transforming not just his own life, but the lives of everyone who worked for him and with him. It would require courage different from what he'd needed to cross rock slides and navigate mountain storms. The courage to be vulnerable, to admit mistakes, to value relationships over results. As Rosie's hooves clicked on the wooden bridge that crossed the creek marking his property line, Marcus realized he was no longer the same man who had built this empire. The challenge now was discovering whether the man he was becoming could create something better than what the man he had been had achieved. The grand iron gates of Caldwell Ranch stood before them like a threshold between worlds. Marcus had passed through these gates hundreds of times over the years, usually focused on business concerns or breeding schedules, rarely pausing to appreciate the symbol they represented. Now, sitting astride Sage with Rosie's lead rope in his hand and Patches trotting alongside, he felt the weight of their significance. The brass nameplate proclaimed Caldwell Ranch Est, 1845. Finest horses in the territory, in letters that had been polished to mirror brightness for 30 years. But looking at it now, Marcus saw something different than pride in achievement. He saw a monument to isolation, a declaration that what mattered most was being recognized as the best rather than being connected to something meaningful. Tom Rodriguez emerged from the main barn, his weathered face showing relief and curiosity in equal measure. Behind him came 3 other ranch hands, all staring with undisguised amazement at their boss's traveling companions. Marcus could read their thoughts as clearly as if they'd spoken aloud. Where was the magnificent Stallion they had expected him to return with, and what was he doing leading a donkey and foal like some itinerant peddler? "Mr. Caldwell," Tom called out, approaching with the careful respect that had characterized their relationship for 15 years. "We were starting to worry. You've been gone 2 weeks, and when the storm hit," his words trailed off as he got his first close look at Marcus's appearance. The man who had left the ranch was always immaculately dressed, his clothes pressed, his boots polished, his demeanor reflecting the controlled precision that made Caldwell Ranch famous for efficiency. The man who had returned looked like he'd been living wild in the mountains, which was essentially true. His expensive clothes were worn and stained, his boots scuffed beyond recognition, and his face carried lines of experience that spoke of challenges met and overcome through means other than money and authority. But most striking was something less visible: an ease in his posture, a genuine warmth in his eyes, a presence that suggested he was fully engaged with the moment rather than mentally calculating the next business decision. "Tom," Marcus said, dismounting with movements that felt different than they had 2 weeks ago, "I'd like you to meet Rosie and Patches. They'll be staying with us permanently." The foreman's confusion was evident but carefully controlled. In 15 years of working for Marcus Caldwell, he'd learned not to question his boss's decisions, no matter how unexpected they might seem. "Yes, sir. Should I put them in the back pasture with the yearlings?" "Actually," Marcus said, surprised by his own certainty, "I want to build them their own space. Something comfortable, close to the house where I can keep an eye on them." Tom's eyebrows rose slightly, the closest thing to open surprise Marcus had ever seen from his reserved foreman. "Close to the house, sir? We've got plenty of space in the regular paddocks. I know what we have, Tom, but these 2 are special. They're not just livestock." Marcus found himself speaking words he'd never imagined saying, driven by convictions that felt both new and ancient. Their family. The silence that followed was profound. The ranch hands exchanged glances that spoke of shared bewilderment at this transformation in their famously distant boss. Marcus Caldwell didn't have family. Everyone knew that. He had employees, business associates, and prize animals that represented investments. But family? The concept seemed as foreign to Caldwell Ranch as snow in July. Marcus walked toward the main house, leading Rosie and Patches past the elaborate horse barns with their brass fittings and imported timber. As they progressed through the heart of his carefully constructed empire, he saw it all through new eyes, the cold efficiency, the emphasis on appearance over substance, the underlying message that what mattered was impressing others rather than creating genuine connections. The house itself, a grand Victorian structure with wraparound porches and ornate woodwork, had always been his pride. Designed by architects from Denver, furnished with pieces shipped from Chicago and San Francisco, it showcased his success to anyone who visited. But walking toward it now with his simple companions, Marcus realized it felt more like a museum than a home. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. The imported furniture arranged with museum precision, the walls lined with awards and photographs documenting his achievements in horse breeding, the rooms maintained in perfect order by a housekeeper who came twice weekly but had strict instructions never to move anything from its designated place. Standing in his own living room, Marcus felt like a stranger visiting someone else's monument to success. The leather furniture was expensive but uncomfortable, chosen for appearance rather than use. The books on the shelves were technical manuals about breeding and veterinary science, with no novels, poetry, or anything that spoke to interests beyond business. The whole space reflected a man who lived entirely for work, with no personal passions or relationships to require accommodation. He walked to the large window that overlooked his prize pastures, where thunder and the other valuable breeding stock grazed in fields maintained like golf courses. These animals represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in investment, genetic lines traced back generations, careful breeding decisions that established his reputation throughout the territory. But watching Rosie and Patches explore their new surroundings in the yard below, Marcus felt something he'd never experienced while looking at his expensive horses: pure, uncomplicated joy. There was no calculation in his pleasure, no assessment of their value to his business plans. He simply enjoyed watching them be themselves, curious, playful, content with simple pleasures that money couldn't buy. The contrast forced him to confront the truth he'd been avoiding for years. His prize horses were magnificent animals, but his relationship with them was fundamentally transactional. They were investments that happened to breathe, assets that required feed and veterinary care, but offered returns in prestige and profit. He knew their bloodlines better than their personalities, their market value better than their individual quirks and preferences. When he stopped seeing his animals as individual beings and started seeing them only as components in a business plan, when had success become more important than satisfaction, profit more meaningful than pleasure? Standing in his grand empty house, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible 2 weeks earlier. Tomorrow, he would begin dismantling the life he'd spent 30 years building and start creating something better in its place. Not destroying it entirely. The ranch was sound, the business profitable, the foundation solid, but transforming it from a monument to achievement into something that might actually be worth achieving. The process would require admitting to his employees that he'd been wrong about priorities that had guided his decisions for decades. It would mean changing systems and relationships that had worked efficiently but never brought happiness. Most challenging of all, it would mean being vulnerable with people who had only known him as an authority figure, opening himself to the possibility of genuine connection, even though genuine connection always carried the risk of genuine loss. Looking out at Rosie and Patches, who were now investigating the ornate fountain that had never been used because he'd been afraid the animals might damage it, Marcus smiled at the irony. He'd spent fortune on decorations meant to impress visitors who rarely came, while denying himself the simple pleasure of watching animals enjoy fresh, flowing water. Tomorrow, he would turn on that fountain for the first time and let whoever wanted to drink from it. Tomorrow, he would begin the work of turning his showcase into a home, his business into a calling, and his isolation into the foundation for the kind of relationships that made success worth having. The silver pocket watch in his vest chimed the hour, but for once, Marcus wasn't thinking about schedules or deadlines. Instead, he was planning the most important project of his life, learning how to live in a way that honored both the man he'd been and the man he was still becoming. The next morning dawned clear and bright, and Marcus found himself awake before sunrise for the first time in years, not because of business obligations, but because of genuine excitement about the day ahead. Through his bedroom window, he could see Rosie and Patches grazing peacefully in the temporary enclosure Tom had hastily constructed the evening before. The sight filled him with a satisfaction that no business achievement had ever matched. By the time Tom and the other ranch hands arrived for their morning duties, Marcus was already outside with a measuring tape and notebook surveying the area where he wanted to build a proper paddock for his new companions. Not just functional space, but something designed with their comfort and happiness in mind. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," Tom said, approaching with his usual respectful caution. "About that paddock you want it built. I've been thinking about it all night, Tom," Marcus interrupted, his voice carrying an energy that surprised them both. "I want to build it myself." The foreman stopped mid-stride, certain he'd misheard. "Sir, with my own hands. I want to cut the posts, dig the holes, string the wire, hang the gate." Marcus looked up from his notebook with eyes bright with purpose. "When's the last time you saw me do actual work instead of just managing other people's work?" Tom considered the question seriously, his weathered face thoughtful. "Can't say I ever have, sir. Not in the 15 years I've worked here." "Exactly. I've forgotten what it feels like to build something myself, to solve problems with my hands instead of my checkbook." Marcus gestured toward the space he'd marked down. "This is going to be different. This is going to be personal." Over the following days, the transformation of Marcus Caldwell became visible to everyone on the ranch. The man who had always appeared in pressed clothes and polished boots now worked alongside his employees in worn denim and scuffed leather, his hands dirty from honest labor, his face animated with the satisfaction of physical accomplishment. Building. The paddock became a community project in ways Marcus had never intended, but found himself embracing. Tom offered advice on post spacing and drainage. The younger hands shared techniques for keeping wire tight and gates level. Even Jake Morrison, the cook who rarely left the bunkhouse kitchen, wandered over during breaks to offer observations and suggestions. But the real magic happened when Patches began supervising the construction. The young Foal seemed fascinated by the building process, investigating every tool, testing every board with his teeth, and generally inserting himself into whatever task Marcus was attempting, rather than being annoyed by the interference. Marcus found himself charmed by Patches's curiosity and touched by his desire to be involved. "He's got opinions about everything," Marcus told Tom one afternoon as Patches rejected yet another arrangement of feed buckets. "Look at him, he knows exactly where he wants his water trough, and he's not accepting any substitutes." Tom watched his boss laugh at the Foal's antics with an expression of amazement. The Marcus Caldwell he'd known for 15 years didn't laugh often, and when he did, it was usually at someone else's expense rather than from genuine delight. This transformation was so complete it was almost unsettling. "Sir," Tom ventured, carefully, "can I ask what happened out there? You seem different." Marcus paused in his hammering and considered how to answer. How could he explain Pete Morrison's elaborate scheme, or the lessons learned from crossing impossible terrain, or the rediscovery of values he'd buried under decades of ambition? How Could he describe the experience of remembering who he'd been before he became so afraid of being hurt that he'd forgotten how to be happy? "I met some good teachers," he said finally. "They reminded me that there's more to life than being successful. There's also being satisfied." The completed paddock was a masterpiece of simple functionality. The posts were straight, the wire tight, the gate hung perfectly level on hinges that swung smooth and silent. But more than its technical perfection, the space radiated care in every detail. Marcus had positioned it to catch the morning sun and afternoon shade, with the water trough placed for easy access and the feed station designed to accommodate both. Rosie's height and Patch's smaller stature. The simple wooden gate bore no brass nameplate or elaborate decoration, just honest craftsmanship that would serve its purpose for decades. Looking at it, Marcus felt a pride different from anything his expensive horses or grand buildings had ever given him. This was something he'd built with his own hands for creatures he loved, not to impress others or increase his net worth, but simply because they deserved the best he could provide. When he led Rosie and Patches into their new home for the first time, their approval was immediate and obvious. Rosie tested the fence with her nose, examined the gate mechanism with apparent interest, and finally settled into the space with the satisfied air of an animal who knew she was welcome. Patches began exploring every corner with unbounded enthusiasm, his joy in the new environment infectious to everyone watching. "They like it," Marcus announced unnecessarily, unable to keep the satisfaction from his voice. "Yes, sir, they surely do," Tom agreed. "Finest paddock on the ranch, if you don't mind my saying so." It was, Marcus realized, probably the truth. Not because he'd spent more money on it than the other facilities, quite the opposite, but because he'd built it with different intentions. Every other structure on Caldwell Ranch had been constructed with efficiency and appearance in mind, designed to impress visitors and maximize productivity. This paddock had been built for love, and that made all the difference. As the sun set on the first day Rosie and Patches spent in their new home, Marcus sat on the porch of his grand house and watched them settle in for the night. The sight filled him with contentment that no bank statement or breeding award had ever provided. He'd spent 30 years accumulating possessions and achievements that proved his worth to the world. But these simple animals had taught him that the most valuable things in life couldn't be purchased, only earned through authentic care and genuine connection. The silver pocket watch in his vest pocket ticked steadily, but its rhythm no longer felt like pressure to accomplish more. Instead, it seemed to be counting moments of genuine happiness, measuring time and experiences that would matter long after all his business successes were forgotten. For a man who had spent decades believing that worth could be calculated in dollars and bloodlines, it was a revelation to discover that the richest moments were often the simplest ones. 6 months later, Marcus Caldwell stood in the same spot where he'd first surveyed his ranch with cold satisfaction so many years ago. But everything he saw now was different, transformed not by major construction or expensive renovations, but by a fundamental shift in purpose that had changed the very soul of Caldwell Ranch. The grand iron gates still stood at the entrance, but their brass nameplate had been replaced with a simple wooden sign that read, "Caldwell Ranch, where every animal matters." The change had been Tom Rodriguez's suggestion, offered hesitantly during one of their daily conversations that had replaced the formal weekly reports of the old days. "It's not as impressive as the old sign," Tom had admitted, "but it says what we're really about now." Marcus had agreed immediately, recognizing the truth in his foreman's words. Caldwell Ranch was no longer about being recognized as the finest operation in the territory. It was about creating a place where animals and people could flourish, according to their individual natures rather than predetermined expectations. The transformation was visible everywhere Marcus looked. The ornate fountain now bubbled constantly, providing fresh water that attracted birds and delighted the animals who gather around it throughout the day. The pristine pastures still maintained their health and beauty, but they now accommodated a more diverse population. Alongside Thunder and the valuable breeding stock grazed retired horses too old for work, rescue animals recovering from neglect, and the occasional injured wildlife that Tom's wife, Maria, insisted they couldn't turn away. Patches had grown into a handsome young donkey whose playful spirit had infected the entire ranch community. He served as unofficial greeter for visitors, entertainment director for the other animals, and beloved mascot for the dozen children who now visited regularly, sons and daughters of employees who had discovered that the once forbidding ranch owner actually enjoyed young company. Rosie had assumed the role of wise matriarch, her calm presence somehow settling disputes between horses, soothing anxious animals, and providing the kind of steady leadership that couldn't be learned from any manual. Her paddock had become the social center of the ranch, with animals and humans alike gravitating toward her peaceful energy. But the deepest changes were in Marcus himself. The man who had once measured every day by profit margins and productivity now found joy in moments that would never appear on any ledger. Teaching Patches new tricks during morning walks, watching Rosie mediate between quarreling horses with patient wisdom, sharing coffee with Tom while they planned improvements based on animal welfare rather than efficiency, reading stories to Jake Morrison's grandchildren when they visited on weekends. His business had adapted to these new priorities in ways that surprised everyone, especially Marcus. Buyers still came from across the territory to purchase Caldwell horses, but now they came for different reasons. Word had spread about horses raised with individual attention, animals trained with patience rather than force, breeding decisions made with character as well as conformation in mind. These horses have something special, a cavalry officer from Fort Collins had told Marcus recently. They're not just well-trained, they're confident, intelligent, eager to work with their riders instead of just for them. How do you do it? Marcus had smiled, thinking of Rosie's teaching methods with Patches. We treat them like individuals instead of inventory. We ask what they need instead of just telling them what we want. The new family portrait hanging in his living room captured the essence of these changes. Instead of the formal photographs of prize horses that had once decorated his walls, the frame now held a candid image of himself with Rosie and Patches, taken during one of their morning walks. His face in the photograph showed lines of genuine happiness rather than professional satisfaction, and his posture reflected the relaxed confidence of a man comfortable with himself and his choices. The leather-bound journal that had once contained only breeding records and profit calculations now served as a daily record of small victories and meaningful moments. Today's entry described Patches successfully jumping a fence he'd been working toward for weeks, Rosie's gentle guidance of a nervous young horse, and the satisfaction of completing a new shelter designed specifically for elderly animals died as evening approached and the mountains painted themselves in sunset colors. Marcus made his way to the paddock where his journey had truly begun. Rosie and Patches greeted him with the casual affection of family members, secure in the knowledge that they were loved for who they were rather than what they could provide. "Well, friends," Marcus said, settling onto the bench he'd built beside their paddock for these daily conversations. "It's been quite a day." Patches trotted over to investigate his pockets for the treats he'd learned to expect, while Rosie approached with the dignified pace of someone who knew that good things came to those who waited patiently. "You know," Marcus continued, offering each animal their favorite snacks, "people keep asking me what happened during those 2 weeks in the mountains. They want to know how I changed so much in such a short time." Rosie regarded him with those patient, intelligent eyes that had guided him through impossible terrain and equally challenging emotional territory. But it wasn't really 2 weeks, was it? It was 30 years of running from the wrong things and toward the wrong goals, followed by 2 weeks of remembering what actually matters. Old Pete understood that better than I did. A letter from Pete Morrison had arrived the previous month, forwarded through a network of mountain traders who knew where to find him when he wanted to be found. The message had been characteristically brief. Heard interesting rumors about changes at Caldwell Ranch. Hope they're true. The boy who loved Jeremiah would be proud. Marcus had written back immediately, filling several pages with stories about Rosie and Patches, updates about the ranch's transformation, and gratitude for gifts that had cost Pete nothing in money, but everything in understanding and compassion. Whether Pete would ever receive the letter was uncertain, but writing it had felt important anyway. The silver pocket watch still ticked steadily in Marcus's vest, but its rhythm had become a comfort rather than a pressure. Time was no longer something to be managed and maximized, but something to be appreciated and shared. The moments spent here with Rosie and Patches, watching the sunset paint the mountains while listening to the contented sounds of animals settling in for the night, were worth more than all the business achievements he'd accumulated over 3 decades of relentless ambition. "Thank you," he said quietly to his companions, "not for the first time and certainly not for the last. Thank you for teaching me that the greatest treasures really do come in unexpected packages. Thank you for showing me that home isn't a place you build with money, but a feeling you create with love." As if understanding the weight of the moment, both animals moved closer to the fence where Marcus sat. Patches rested his chin on the rail beside Marcus's arm, while Rosie positioned herself where her presence provided comfort without demanding attention. The 3 of them sat together in comfortable silence as darkness settled over the mountains, and stars began appearing in the clear Colorado sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and continued learning, but tonight there was only peace, contentment, and the deep satisfaction that comes from finally understanding what wealth really means. Sometimes the greatest treasures in life really do come in the most unexpected packages. Marcus Caldwell had spent 30 years looking right past what he needed most, chasing after what he thought he wanted instead. But in the end, a stubborn old donkey and her gentle foal had taught him that the richest life isn't measured by what you own, but by who you love and how deeply you're willing to let yourself be loved in return. The silver pocket watch ticked steadily through the night, counting moments that would matter forever.